Tell me timeline. Where the stuff has come from the past to current. On March 1917, the February Revolution forces Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. A weak provisional government takes over. On November 1917, Vladimir Lenin leads the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution, seizing power in Petrograd. On 1918-1922, the brutal Russian Civil War rages between the Bolshevik Reds and anti-communist Whites. On March 1918, Russia signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, exiting WWI at the cost of massive territorial losses. On 1918-1921, the harsh economic policy of war communism nationalizes all industries and forcibly confiscates peasant grain. On 1921, Lenin replaces war communism with a market-oriented new economic policy, NEP, to restore economic stability. On December 1922, the Treaty on the Creation of the USSR officially unites Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia into the Soviet Union. On January 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies, triggering a bitter internal power struggle for control of the Communist Party. On 1928, Joseph Stalin consolidates total power, ends the NEP, and launches the first mandatory 5-year plan for rapid industrialization. On 1929, mass agricultural collectivization begins, forcing independent peasants onto state-run collective farms. On 1932-1933, forced collectivization causes catastrophic, widespread famines, resulting in millions of civilian deaths across Ukraine and Kazakhstan. On 1936-1938, Stalin initiates the Great Purge, executing or imprisoning millions of perceived political, military, and civilian enemies in Gulag labor camps. On August 1939, the USSR and Nazi Germany signed the Tactical Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. On June 1941, Germany violates the pact and invades the USSR, initiating the devastating Great Patriotic War. On February 1943, the Red Army achieves a decisive victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, turning the tide of WWII. On May 1945, Soviet troops capture Berlin, successfully ending WWII in Europe and cementing the USSR as a global superpower. On 1947, the Cold War begins as deep geopolitical and ideological tensions solidify between the USSR and the United States. On 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its very first atomic bomb, breaking the American nuclear monopoly. On March 1953, Joseph Stalin dies of a stroke, bringing an end to his brutal totalitarian regime. On 1956, Nikita Khrushchev denounces Stalin's crimes in his famous secret speech, launching a domestic de-Stalinization policy. On 1957, the USSR launches Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, initiating the global space race. On 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space, orbiting the Earth aboard Vostok 1. On 1962, the dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis brings the Soviet Union and the United States to the absolute brink of nuclear war. On 1964, Khrushchev is abruptly ousted by party elites. Leonid Brezhnev assumes leadership, initiating the long era of stagnation. On 1979, the Soviet military invades Afghanistan, sparking a costly, decade-long quagmire that drains vital state resources. On 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary and introduces systemic glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, reforms. On April 1986, the catastrophic Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurs in Ukraine, exposing deep flaws in Soviet state secrecy and engineering. On 1989, Soviet forces completely withdraw from Afghanistan. Anti-communist revolutions successfully topple Soviet-backed regimes across Eastern Europe. On 1990, Baltic republics begin declaring independence. The Communist Party votes to relinquish its monopoly on political power. On August 1991, hardline communist officials stage a failed coup attempt against Gorbachev, severely shattering the party's authority. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet hammer and sickle flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. And on December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet formally votes the USSR out of existence, replacing it with independent post-Soviet states. See you in the next one.